my name is Callid Keefe-Perry, and I am faculty at the Boston College Clough School of Theology and Ministry. So we're some of the folks at Boston College who do more work connected to practical and public theology, connected to our colleagues who are in the theology department who do more kind of analytic and philosophical traditions of the theological work. So I'm just down the street on ComAv. As is relevant to the work here at CURA, I'm at work on a book for Fordham University Press on white Christian nationalism, and specifically what are some of the things that congregations have been doing that seems to have some promise and in terms of addressing some of the concerns about kind of the polarizing qualities of white Christian nationalism and Christian nationalism kind of broadly, and what some congregations are doing to kind of name that and to resist some of it and to address some of the problems of it. So that book is a broader look at the theoretical and theological underpinnings that we look at, how we talk about what it is that white Christian nationalism is, or what Christian nationalism is, and then more specifically, what are some of the practices that are taking place at the congregational level that seem to be useful in addressing some of these issues and either slowing or reversing the kind of polarization that happens around the way that Christianity is thought about when Christian nationalism becomes the dominant discourse. My most recent publication was a book around the ways that we can think about imagination and imagination studies as part of the work in theological studies and theology. And while that may not seem like it's directly related to the work of Christian nationalism, there's actually a pretty significant theme underneath it, because part of what I was trying to do in that book, it's called Sense of the Possible, an introduction to theology and imagination. Part of what I was trying to say is actually the capacity of the human imagination and the kinds of things that we build as part of the kind of social imaginary that we live in actually has a lot to do with what constitutes theological work in general. And part of the question, and part of the way I ask the question now about some of my more sociological and social science research around Christian nationalism has to do with kind of what is the social imaginary that has been built up or constructed by the folks who feel as if some of the rhetoric and language of the Christian nationalist conversation is compelling to them. Like, what is the version of the world that they see that might be different from people who don't see it? And kind of the analytic category of the imagination is very significant for me. The last book was a little bit more theoretical and doctrinal, and engaging with some bigger categories of how are theologians using imagination, and how does imagination kind of factor into the work that we do as practical theologians and pastoral theologians and things of that nature. So it was a little bit more removed, but this next piece is saying, and how does that hit the road? You know, what are some of the ways in which some of those questions about imagination and imaginaries play out in terms of the actual kind of politics and work on the ground in congregational life? So sometimes people go, wait, what was what was your last book? But there's a thread and a theme there, and it's certainly related to the kind of theoretical way that I'm approaching a lot of the work I'm doing now. Yeah, so I was trained as a practical theologian, actually here at Boston University, and my advisor in that work was the former dean of the School of Theology, Mary Elizabeth Moore. And one of the things that Dr. Moore used to always say is that if you're going to do the work of practical theology and engage in work in social sciences, she would often say, don't dabble. So that sometimes what happens is theologians who want to start studying IR or international relations or social scientific study of religion or some other field, they kind of just do a little bit just so that they can understand it and then continue to do their theology. And I was trained so that if you're going to bother doing the work, if you're doing psychometric studies and psychology of religion, or you're going to do large-scale survey and it's statistical analysis, whatever it is, you should be able to do that work well enough that you can be conversant enough as it on their terms. And that was always very compelling to me. Once upon a time as a student, and now doing my own work and training other folks and graduate students and doctoral students. If you're going to bother engaging in the work of the study of politics or society and employ social scientific measures, qualitative or quantitative, do it the way that the people who do that all the time would do it. Like, don't do a watered down version of it. Do it the way that people do that work in sociology or in psychology of religion, or whatever you name. And so the fact that I'm part of a field that both encourages the kind of work being done on the ground to be done well, up to standards at our best, that are relevant and legible to people outside of the field of theology, is great. And then to be able to take that work and speak back to people who are Christian and say, here's why this stuff, this social scientific stuff, this non-theology stuff is relevant to the work of the church, I always felt was a very fruitful dynamic. And at its best, the stuff we learn out in the world through whatever techniques that we're doing from what other fields, anthropology, political science, you name it, ought to be able to critique the church. And then there's some places where we look at policy, or we look at kind of patterns or trends or practices in congregations, or just in behavior of Christians in general. It ought to be able to critique those too. So I'm of the mind that practical theology at its best allows for kind of a mutual kind of position of critique, that some of the theological and ethical reflection can help shape behavior and would provide kind of strategic recommendations for things to be done differently. In my case, I'm interested in resisting Christian nationalism, so let's change some of those behaviors. But it's also the case that I think done well, practical theology doesn't just start with theory, it also starts with practice, hence the practice in practical theology. Let's figure out a way to better study what's actually going on, and if we need to shift how we're thinking about this because of what the data says, then we ought to take that seriously too. And I find that kind of the in-between space really fertile, and I've always felt glad to be part of professional conversations where that is normative. I'm, part of my title is I'm a professor of public theology. That's the public theology part of it is there in my what they hired me for, and kind of key to that discipline in general is the recognition that we need to learn to talk in a way that actually reaches across doctrinal boundaries. There's some times in which theology is totally impenetrable unless you already agree to the things that it says, at which point in time it's very hard to reach outside of your bubble. And the public theology conversation is one that tries to take seriously both interdisciplinarity, but also the need to discuss things in a way such that it's actually intelligible to people, even if they don't agree with the same list of things that they agree with you about. So I have always enjoyed being part of both of those conversations as a practical theologian and a public theologian, and part of what CURA does for me is a kind of it's a testing ground in some ways, because it's not full of theologians, and so I need to make sure that what I'm saying is actually applicable and useful and understandable by folks. And in that regard, I'm always very grateful for the ability. I'll sometimes take notes to myself, like, well, that didn't go over well, So I have to learn to figure out the best ways to make that communication happen. But at the end of the day, I find that I'm glad to be part of those conversational communities in practical and public theology, because it slots pretty well into the things that I have a lot of interest and passion for too. Yeah, so I'm actually really excited about what CURA is doing these days. So as I mentioned earlier, I did my doctoral work at the School of Theology here at Boston University, and I somehow managed to get through the entirety of my degree and not ever once be plugged into CURA, even though my whole time here I was doing work on the intersection of public theology, public life, and the kinds of things that CURA often asks questions about. But I think sometimes it's kind of a hidden jewel here at Boston University, and so I'm actually really glad that things are kind of turning the corner in terms of like letting everyone know what a great opportunity it is for interdisciplinary conversation. I was a CURA fellow last year when the conversations were about thinking about empire and religion. That's related to the work that I do on nationalism. And so then this year, when the theme became nationalism and internationalities and international kind of perspectives on religion, as it turns up in individual states that are pursuing religious nationalist identities, I said, oh, well, this is even more close to my home base. So I met before his passing, Peter, who was a huge part of the kind of founding of CURA. So like had awareness of like the concepts that went into what it is that CURA is, but didn't actually ever come to any of the CURA events until last year. And one of the things I could say about it is it has consistently last year and then since we've started this year been one of the most compelling places for interdisciplinary conversation that takes seriously religion and culture. And it's one of those places where sitting around a conversation table could be ethicists and media scholars and anthropologists and political scientists and sociologists of religion and sociologists of healthcare and theologians. And so, you spread all those folks around the room. We don't all speak the same disciplinary language, but what you get good at is saying, well, I'll put out what my perspective would be, disciplined by my field, and maybe that'll be of interest or not. Probably people will find it interesting one way or the other, but we learn to listen for what we need to listen for our own careers and our own audiences. And the fact that everyone is as interested in hearing from a different set of not just opinions that are personal, but also the things that we ask about are very much shaped by the fields that we come from. And so like learning to hear both critiques and encouragements and inquiry in general that come from different kinds of constellations of habits that get formed, whether you're doing sociology or theology or ethics or philosophy of the nation or something. That's actually very compelling, and it feels as if it is a really good place to test out whether or not the things that you are saying that you want to be kind of broadly understandable by an intelligent public, whether that actually plays out or not, or whether you're just telling yourself a story about that. So I think CURA is on the upswing in terms of visibility, which I'm really excited about, and really glad to be able to be part of that conversation again this year.